a button that said, please don't tell the president what comes after a gazillion. And that brings me back to my thesis: time is running short for America. We are at a tipping point. Now let me answer my own question about where America is going. America will not follow this president's retreat towards European socialism. You and I and our fellow Republicans across this great country of ours are going to work tirelessly to make sure that America will reclaim our greatness. This is the greatest country in the history of the world, and we're going to work hard to keep it that way. I want to shift gears for a moment now and talk about our government addiction to debt. It has been in the news just today. Again, there was another set of news stories about the negotiations going on in Washington. Let's step back and see what's really going on. Last month, the president took to the talk shows with what I found to be a very curious message. As you know, he's been fighting with Congress, trying to get them to increase the country's debt ceiling yet again. This is what he says. He says if we do not raise our national debt ceiling, we will have an economic crisis. I think he's got it backwards, by the way. We can't raise our economy ceiling because we do already have a debt crisis. Let's get this straight now once and for all. Under this president's watch, our national debt's gone from $9 trillion to $14 trillion and climbing. Yet he now threatens us with global financial crisis if we don't borrow even more. So we are now in a position where we need to do more of what put us into this mess, increasing our indebtedness in order to stave off global financial crisis. Does that make sense to anybody here? Let me translate this message from the president in English. When he says that we must increase our debt ceiling in order to stave off a global financial crisis, he's basically saying we need more debt in order to keep our debt from strangling us. So the President of the United States is reduced to threatening us with global financial crisis if we don't take actions that will exacerbate an American economic crisis. In Washington, they're making this from a pretty complicated debate. It really isn't that hard. Our unprecedented $14 trillion debt is endangering not only our future, but also our present. Everybody talks about how damaging this debt will be to future generations, and that is certainly true. But it is also damaging our country right this minute. There's not a sober person in America who doesn't realize that excessive government spending is at the root of our nation's economic problems. The smart guys in Washington insist that more debt is crucial to our economic survival. We have to borrow more, they assure us, because we have borrowed too much, or something like that. I don't know about you, but that only makes sense in Washington, D.C. So what should we do about this coming debt ceiling crisis? The Obama administration is having a hard time grasping this economics 101 thing. So as a public service, I'm going to help them out. I'm going to make this easy for them to understand. Here we go. My beautiful wife, Supriya, and I, we've got 3 great children. My little girl is 9. My boys are 7 and 4. And I hate to admit this. It's every father's fear. But before you know it, one day, despite my best efforts, they too will become teenagers. I'm preparing myself for the day when one of my children, one of my kids, calls home. I already know which kid it's going to be, by the way. I already know which one's going to do this. I can see it already. He says, Dad, well, there's a problem. It's like, well, you remember that credit card I have? Well, I owe $6,000 on it. And if I don't pay it, there's going to be real trouble. So could I borrow some more money? That is basically what our federal government is saying to taxpayers today. We spent money in Washington that we don't have. So we need to borrow more from you right now in order to stave off the creditors. So what is a parent to do? Well, basically, we have 3 options. I suppose my wife and I could say, sure, here's some more money, no problem. And that's what the president's asking us to do right now. That's one option. And by the way, in my mind, I call that the grandparent option. It is an amazing thing. I grew up with the strictest parents you'll ever meet in America. And yet a gene turned off when they become grandparents. Growing up, my dad, just on an aside, my dad's one of 9 children, grew up in a house without electricity, without running water, the only one in the family to get past the 5th grade. I know because I've heard these stories every single day of my life. One day I asked him for an allowance when I was growing up. He asked me how much I was going to pay him for the clothes I was wearing and the food I was eating in his house. So I don't understand these people now. They've become grandparents. My little boy the other day, my little 7-year-old's losing a bunch of his teeth. He looks at me. It's so amazing how smart your children are. My little boy looks me in the face and goes, "Daddy, I need to go spend the night at Poppy and Grandma's house." I said, "Why do you need to spend the night there?" He said, "Well, Daddy, you see, the tooth fairy brings a lot more money when I go over there than when I stay at home." So certainly, as one option, we could adopt the grandparent option and just give them more money and say no problem. But it's an option that will lead to more irresponsible behavior and eventually to bankruptcy. Our kids won't learn anything if we do that time and time again. That is pretty much what the taxpayers have done for many years. That's what the president wants us to do again now, even though that is precisely what is crushing our economy. There's a second option. I could say to my child, "No, look, that's your problem. You're not going to get anything from me. Have a nice day." Well, I can say that. The reality is there's no way my wife would actually let me do that, just to be honest with you. The problem, though, with that option is it is my child. We're part of the same family. If he fails, I fail. But there is a third option. I could say this. I could say, "Son, here's the deal. I'll loan you the money and get the credit card paid off right now." That's the easy part. But now, son, here's the rest of the story. You're not going to have a credit card for a while. And we're going to make some structural changes in the way you live. You're not going to be eating out anymore. You're not going to be going to the mall. You're going to have to sell your car. You're going to have to go get a job. You're not going to spend more than you make. You are going to start saving some money every month. That, my friends, is precisely the message the taxpayers of America must send to President Obama and the federal government in Washington. This debate over the debt limit may be the most important thing Congress does in the next 2 years. The truth is, I don't try to give advice to Congress very often. They've got a hard enough job fighting with a president who is philosophically dead wrong. But on this issue of increasing the debt, every Republican must weigh in. America is addicted to spending. Republicans in Congress have a choice. We have to decide here and now. Are we going to continue to be the enablers to that spending addiction? Now is the time. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now is the time to insist on a balanced budget amendment with other bold structural reforms. The president is desperate to raise the debt limit. We should force him to accept these kinds of structural reforms. We should force the federal government to confront its spending addiction. And let's be clear. You will always hear an excuse about why we should do this tomorrow. I was in Congress for 3 years. There will never be a time when it is convenient or easy to curb government spending. That day is never going to come. The liberals will always say that curbing government spending is heartless, cruel, and wrong. The guys on Wall Street will always say we have to increase the debt ceiling. There will never be a time when they don't say it is crucial to our survival. It'll never happen. Speaker Boehner, the Republican House, just passed a bill requiring spending cuts, spending caps, and a balanced budget. The Democrats' response was to call it not realistic and a gimmick. Somebody's going to have to explain that to me. Not realistic to cut government spending, to cap government spending, and to balance our budget? I'll tell you what's not realistic. It's not realistic to live in a fantasy world where you think you can keep borrowing and the bill will never come due. It's not realistic to think that you can keep spending $3 for every $2 that you take in. It's not realistic to believe that government spending will grow the American economy. It is not realistic to raise taxes in a recession. It is not realistic to put the federal government in charge of our health care. Don't get me started on what's not realistic. There's nothing about the way that President Obama and the Democrats are running the federal government that is realistic. Here in Ohio, you balanced your budget. Your Republican governor, the Republican majorities in your legislature, they made the tough choices. In Louisiana, we've cut spending by $10 billion over 4 years. Republican governors all over the country are saying we are not going to shift this burden to our people and our businesses. Make no mistake about it. The fundamental decision that every leader has to make in the state houses or in our nation's capital is during this recession. Do we make the tough choices in government, or do we shift these burdens to our people and our businesses? Every state has had to make spending cuts. Look, nobody enjoys cutting spending, but it is the only responsible thing to do. Is it really too much to ask our federal government to balance our country's budget? Now is the time to get this done. We won a majority in Congress this past year. It's time to put that majority to use. You know, it wasn't that long ago the American people fired the Republicans in Congress, took the majority away from them, and I would argue the Republican Party, we as Republicans, were fired with cause. We stopped standing up for our principles. We started making excuses for the kind of spending the other side. We used to criticize the other side for doing. Now we've got the majority back. Now it is time to put that majority to use. The American people are with us. We must force the president to accept, quote, unrealistic structural changes to go along with whatever agreement they come up with. Our leaders in Congress must not shrink from this fight. The reality is, I truly believe in my heart of hearts, in my bones, we are blessed to live in the greatest country in the history of the world. I know we enjoy freedoms that are just unsurpassed across this entire world of ours and going all the way back through our entire world's history. But I also know that our children's future depends on the decisions that are being made right now in Washington, D.C. Every single generation of Americans has left more opportunities for their children and grandchildren than we inherited from our parents. And that's the American dream. If our kids work hard and get a great education, they should be able to do even better than we did. We must not become the first generation that mortgages our children's future, that leaves fewer opportunities for them because we're too afraid to make the tough choices. That is what this debt fight in Washington, D.C. is about. That is what this next presidential election is about. And as I close, let me acknowledge the elephant in the room. Every time you get a group of Republicans together, everybody